about stopping this reality.
Promised to be this tax-cutting, reforming Prime Minister.
Stop the globalisation trash.
Boris Johnson has completely undone this good chaps theory of government. Welcome to The Table, a new discussion show from Byline TV, where we'll be having productive debates about the things that matter, with people we might not always agree with. This is not just another talk show, though. At this table, there's no hiding behind sound bites or slogans. We're going to get to the heart of the issues and explore the philosophical and cultural underpinnings behind our positions. And nothing is off the table. Joining me at the table tonight, we have playwright, novelist and broadcaster Bonnie Greer, author, commentator and former economics editor for Channel 4 News, Paul Mason, and financial analyst and conservative commentator, Albie Amankona. And me as your host, trying to take you all through it, Marina Purkiss. Tonight, we'll be talking about the much debated diversity of the Tory leadership candidates. And with the contest coming down to an ethnic minority candidate and a woman, we'll be asking, how much does diversity really matter? And after the sweltering heatwave we've all endured this week, with some of the hottest temperatures ever recorded in the UK, we'll also be debating the climate crisis and what our next PM plans to do about it, and examining how our net zero agenda can work in the midst of a cost of living crisis. So let's get straight into it. The Tory leadership showdown has been heavily critiqued, with all the candidates seeming to be guilty of just not being that inspiring. But one area that it has won praise in is its diversity. We started this leadership runoff with 8 candidates, 50% of whom were not white and 50% were women. With a range of ethnic backgrounds amongst the candidates, is this progress for the Tory party? And is it a win for diversity? Let's go to you. Albie, thoughts?
Yes, I think it is progress for the Tory party. If we just look at things on a purely factual and historical basis, in the 1960s we had prominent Tory MPs like Enoch Powell talking about the rivers of blood and all of the ramifications of that. And now we have a leadership election where at the beginning 50% of them were ethnic minorities. We're now down to the final 2, 50% ethnic minority, Rishi Sunak, and a woman, Liz Truss. So the Conservative Party is either going to elect its 3rd female leader or the country's first ethnic minority Prime Minister. And I think whatever side of the House you are on, I think that speaks a lot for this country, the Conservative Party, and politics more broadly. And I think that does display progress, because that would not have happened in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s. Even the noughties is happening now.
But do we think it's a real win, like a tangible win? Is there real diversity of thought there?
Well, there's a diversity of Tory thought. Look, diversity is a good thing. And as you say, I mean, I remember Enoch Powell. And it's a good thing that the politics of Powellism have indeed been pushed to the extremes, although they have not disappeared. The only problem is that a child growing up in 1968 in the town I come from, Lee in Lancashire, at the time when Enoch Powell made his Rivers of Blood speech, had every chance of progressing through the ranks of the middle class, the upper middle class, and achieving in-life social mobility. I can tell you now that it would be a miracle if anybody achieved that from any of the so-called red wall towns. That is, yes, diversity has gone forward, inequality has gone forward, social mobility has gone backwards. And
Paul,
so I'm not saying that the diversity is a bad thing. We've had President Erdogan, the chief Ayatollah of Iran, and the Russian president in a conference. That was a highly diverse conference of totalitarian murderers. So yes, diversity is good, but the substantive thing is social justice. And that panel of the Tory leadership candidates was substantially absent social justice as a value among them. Sorry.
Just to jump in there, interesting that you compared the Tory leadership race to a bunch of totalitarian leaders. A little bit dramatic, but I take your point. But on social justice, I mean, one of the candidates, Nadeem Zahawi, who was actually knocked out in the first round, arrived to Britain as a refugee, couldn't speak a word of English, had no money, progressed very well at school, got a good education, started a business, YouGov, which all of us are very familiar with, rose up the ranks there, joined the Conservative Party, became an MP, and then was a leadership contender within a few years of him becoming a minister. So I think we've just got to accept that is progress. That is also an example, Paul, of social mobility, to go from non-English speaking refugee to Chancellor of the Exchequer and a potential contender for Prime Minister of Britain. What is social mobility if not that?
So why don't you think most people in Britain experience social mobility? What is it? Was it just the specialness of individuals? I can accept that because that can be a thing. Surely what the Conservatives should have been asking is, why is it that social mobility is stuck, inequality is high, that life chances are dire, absolutely dire, including for the ethnic minority groups that these candidates claim to be in some way avatars of? You are, I think it's 14, correct me, 14 times more likely to have a child die during childbirth if you're from an African Caribbean background than from a white background.
4 times, actually.
Yeah, it might. Yeah, it's high. So why? I would want them to be asking, despite the incredible success we all achieved, the last 2 candidates, PPE, Oxford PPE candidates, why doesn't everybody else? That's surely the number one question that politics should be asking.
Yeah, I think we're looking at a collision of generations and eras. My growing up was in the civil rights movement in the 60s, and nobody from that time who was of color would be in the Republican Party, the equivalent of the Conservative Party. Even though the Republican Party was the party that liberated people, it switched with FDR. So you wouldn't have had that. But what began to happen in the 80s is that upwardly mobile parents of color refused to have their children to be assumed to be something. They refused to be assumed to be something. I didn't know that some of my family were Republicans and voted for the Republicans. I mean, they came around with Obama, but they're still skeptical Democrats. And I think what's happened is that the left has made assumptions that are out of date. And the Democratic Party, for instance, in America, is losing Latinx men, losing African American men, losing that whole cohort, and they're not asking the right questions about it. And I think it has to do with assumptions. And I think people of your generation and your parents, who people would have looked at and thought, oh, these, obviously they're going to be Labour Party because they're brown. No, they said no, not necessarily. And I think what happened with the left, and it's true in the Democratic Party, they forgot that they were lumping people, in a sense. They were putting people in a basket, and they were making an assumption about them. I mean, I do that. I mean, I've said on Twitter to people, if people looked up the lineup of the Conservative Party, in the future, they will say the Conservative Party was extremely diverse because technically they are. They had this field. There was a possibility, I don't think she was going to make it, but there was a possibility there was going to be a black woman as prime minister from the Conservative Party and a woman on the hard right. So,
she's not on the hard
well,
right.
Let me just say this. Let me say this. I'll take it back. To me, she is, okay? Now, the people might not think so, but I would see her as a right-winger, for sure, with a capital R. But there are people who would assume that she wouldn't be because of where she was brought up and so forth. So I think that there is this, on the left, an unconscious kind of not realization that people of color are saying, don't put me in that basket. Maybe I'm there, but don't put me there. So I think it's I was going to say dangerous in a way, in the sense that what I observe from the leadership race is people working very hard to prove to you that they weren't what you thought they were. And I mean that not in a conscious way, but they were very, very strong about being something else or being not what same lot of voters would think they were. They aren't those things. So Suella Braverman, Kemi Badenoch, all of them were people who, if you looked at their background, and even the Home Secretary, it would be easy to make assumptions about where they would be, and they are not there. They're not in that space. Mm-hmm. And what we need to look at is why they're not in that space. I'm not saying why in a negative way, but why aren't they there? And what does it look like for the future? Because I think that coming from the United States, the Democratic Party, and also looking at the Labor Party, the white working class, we call blue collar in America, I don't know, I think they're deserting the left. And that has to also be looked at as well, because that's part of the phenomenon. I'm making a huge generalization, huge. But it's an interesting kind of juxtaposition that's going on about that. And I, as somebody who would not vote conservative, am not a conservative, would not vote for the Conservative Party under any circumstances, I have to look at why so many people of color are coming through there, getting positions of power, holding strong allegiance to conservative values. I'm thinking, well, how did this happen?
One of the questions I'm still not clear about, but I don't recall any candidate, some of them dropped by the wayside quite quickly, I don't recall any candidate, including those who were of colour, actually accepting that structural racism exists in Britain.
But they can't.
Let's get to the first base. Did any of them? Because Theresa May did. I mean, Theresa May's report on, I can't remember, it's had some euphemistic title about race issues in Britain, made it really clear that all the structural obstacles that lie in your path, the famous how many CVs you have to send out and the rest of it, it's pretty, I think, in public life, in corporate life, it's pretty clear that structural racism exists, and you have to do things to overcome it. But I never heard that theme explored in the Tory
because those individuals would tell you it didn't exist because it didn't exist for them.
I'm not even sure there, because it's the Sewell report, which was controversial even within the Conservative Party, for basically saying structural racism doesn't exist. White working class boys are the most oppressed people in the world. I summarise, but I don't think it's an article of conservative faith that structural racism.
No, but I think,
if I can just jump in on the Sewell report, was I actually think you summed it up in a slightly unfair way. Look, there was controversy around the claim that structural racism didn't exist. I thought it was an unhelpful comment, personally. But this whole debate about whether structural racism does exist or doesn't exist, to be fair to me, it doesn't really matter to me. What matters to me are the policies and the actions that any government, Labour, Conservative, Lib Dem, SNP, would take to close racial disparities in this country. And I'm not sure if you read the entire report, I'm not sure if you read the Inclusive Britain strategy, but in the Sewell report there are 24 recommendations, all bar one of them were acted upon in the Inclusive Britain strategy. I think there are 74 policy points in there, including policies looking into the disparities in medical equipment. There's a policy which is looking into the disparities in maternal deaths when they're giving birth. We're actually looking into the example that you gave earlier and finding out what's going on and how we can close it, looking into educational outcomes. So actually, the actions that this government is taking are similar actions to the actions that anti-racist campaigners have been calling for decades. But everyone just wants to focus on a comment about institutional racism not existing and not the practical policies
but the tone of the
government
report
is taking.
And I read it, I didn't read it twice, I read it all the way through. The tone of the report from the beginning was, it's okay, but we're going to fix this anyway, but it's all right here. It's
what do you
okay
think of the
here.
policies, Bonnie?
I got to the policies are fine. They're fine. But why did they...
Are they good or bad?
They're not bad.
So they're good?
They're not bad.
So they're good.
Okay, they're not bad. There's another space in between there. It's not bad. But my point is, the beginning of the report is, we're going to give you, at the end we give you these recommendations, and they're good recommendations, but at the beginning of the report the tone was, but it's okay here, it's okay, it's better than most, and they use even the term like the Caribbean experience. I have no idea what that means. And the tone of the report trivializes what they are attempting to do. And I think it's why people were angry. The recommendations were fine. It's the tone of the report. And the recommendations, in a way, are almost robotic because the tone of the report is that it's actually okay, better than most other places. It's not right. That's not true.
So it's not better than most other countries in Europe because that's actually what the research found.
Look, there's another part, let me move on, May. There's another part to this. The government's anti-racist strategy isn't just about doing good things for people of colour, okay? It's part of a governing ethos that saw ministers and Conservative MPs egg on white racist football fans when they booed the taking of the knee. They said it was fine to do it. I went undercover on one of those demos to defend Winston Churchill's statues, full of far-right extremists, full of overt white supremacist racists. The one party they love is the Conservative Party. They love it because the Tory party tells them it's good, it's fine for you to say what they were implicitly and explicitly saying. There is no racism in this country. It's them. The black people, the BLM people, it's they who are the racists against us. The entire content...
Which Conservative politician has said that?
How long have you been in politics not to understand the difference between text and subtext? Text and subtext is the matter of politics. When Boris Johnson said it's fine to boo the knee, who was he appealing to?
So, Paul, actually, you'll know very well that the reason I'm here is because of my intervention on that very issue. Yeah. And I was very critical of the government and of the Conservative Party for their response to England football fans booing the England football team when they were representing us on the global stage. I thought that was not the right thing to do. But actually, the response that I got after that letter was overwhelmingly positive. And the way that you are describing the Conservative Party as a black Conservative Party member is not a description that I recognise.
Can I just say something quickly, and just to be in the middle of this? I look at history, and I'm interested in the migration from, say, the 60s and the 70s, the middle 80s, to now, in terms of how people of color look at themselves, how they look at the political parties. The parties on the left made big assumptions about people of color. They just did. The Democratic Party still does. And maybe Labor, I don't know. But certainly the Democratic Party still does. And so, in a sense, doesn't do anything in terms of working on people. Well, it makes assumptions about where people are, about what they're thinking about, what they want. What seems to me that began to happen at the end of the 80s, especially with parents of color, is they wanted their kids to go to the best schools that they could go get them into, like every parent does. And they also wanted them to rise above labels, because part of what was happening that came out of the 60s and the 70s is that we were labeled. We labeled ourselves, and we were labeled. And so parents bringing up kids and having kids in the 80s and 90s said we didn't want our kids labeled. We want them to just go and be whatever they're going to be. Schools at that point, by that point, have been literally desegregated as a result of the 60s and 70s. So this young cohort was allowed in, not allowed in, but they got in by their own merit, because in the old days, it didn't matter how smart you weren't going to get into school if you were a person of color. Now, people can actually have merit and get in, and it changes the shape of everything. You can suddenly be, and I'm not knocking this, but it's fascinating to me to watch this cohort and to watch these arcs of time. You can actually be on the right now and be a person of color, where before, people would look at you like you were nuts. But now you can, and now you can make the defense of that and the explanation of that, because a barrier has been lowered by one's own parents and also the society. And so what is really interesting to look at this cohort of people who are running for office, it was amazing to me to watch, because partly the subtext of Kemi, partly the subtext of Suella, partly the subtext of, the other person.
Rishi.
Not Rishi, that was interesting,
Nadine.
not Rishi. No, not even Nadine, the women. The subtext of them was, for me, this is who I am. I'm going to be this, and I'm going to be this in defiance of whatever you think you want me to be, wherever you think you want to put me. And I wouldn't be surprised if these two ladies hadn't spent a lot of their young lives actually saying, I'm not standing in that corner, I'm not getting in that queue, I'm not going here, I'm not going there. So partly this new generation is being formed by saying no, no, no. And what's fascinating is the Conservative Party has become their home. And that's an interesting thing to me because I grew up around Shire Tories who would not give the time of day to anybody of color except if they were going to do some serving for them, okay? Suddenly, this has all changed.
Was that not progress?
Well, no, I didn't say it wasn't progress. I'm looking at it.
But do you see that as a good thing? Because I think one of the
no,
things
I didn't see it. I don't see it as a bad
thing.
thing.
I'm just asking your opinion.
Yeah, I'm going to tell you.
Do you see it as a good thing?
I see it as a fascinating thing. It's fascinating to me because it's in my lifetime. That's what I'm trying to say. It isn't happening.
I just to steer us onto the next. It leads on from this.
Okay,
It's about
I'm really fascinated.
In boxes.
Yeah.
And I think this is something we need to address.
Yeah.
Because I think one of the things that's come out of this is that, and I know I tweeted about it and got a big old pile on, is because there is a question mark over, do these ethnic minority leaders have a responsibility? So when they get into these positions of powers, my point was, is it really a win for diversity if you pull up the ladder?
See, and you hit, but you know what? You hit the key. You hit the key.
They haven't pulled up the ladder.
But, no, I'm not saying. No, wait, hang on.
Can I pull out one example of where they have?
Please.
So, throughout the leadership campaign, we saw all of these heartwarming backstories where we're talking about people like, for example, Priti Patel's parents, who she was forced to admit in an interview under her own points-based immigration system would not have been allowed into this country. The same applies for, I believe, Suella Bravo and I believe Sajid Javid and Nadeem Zahawi. Does that not feel like a pulling up of the ladder? And I appreciate, I don't expect everyone to go into a PM and have the burden on their shoulders to do the right thing, but we essentially had a group of Tory leadership candidates, very diverse, all pulling up the ladder.
Can I just say quickly, that's the next part what I was going to say. That is fascinating to me. I'm not making a judgment call on it. It's an interesting thing because I would have felt and would been brought up to feel that I have to turn around and extend my hand. Now, I'm not saying these people haven't done it. It's not personal. But it's an interesting ethos where you don't have to do that anymore. Well, hang on. And no, I'm not surprised. I'm think it's an interesting, Paul, it's an interesting thing. I don't think it's that simple. It's a very interesting arc. And I'm looking at that because for some people, and I know some young conservatives of color who I like very much, they are people who their very being is the story, and and that's a good thing.
How do they feel about dragging Syrian refugees onto a plane?
Well, they don't answer
I just need to provide some balance here because I think you're both actually.
How do they feel? Hold on. How do those people feel? You know them. I don't know them. How do they feel about seeing refugees from Afghanistan and Syria dragged in straitjackets, knee on the neck, onto a plane to be deported to Rwanda by this lovely, diverse Conservative government? What does that make them feel about the morals, ethics, standards in public life? You may know, you're a Conservative.
Look, I feel that the Rwanda policy was an extreme policy, but I can understand.
Was it racist?
No, I don't think it's racist.
Why has no white people been dragged on?
I think we can come to this, but we're deviating from the point. You said categorically that these ethnic minority Conservatives are, I quote, pulling up the ladder for other ethnic minorities. That was the question that was posed to us. I disagree. Sajid Javid was the health secretary when he ordered the review into medical biases within medical equipment. Kemi Badenoch was the equalities minister when they opened the Office for Health Improvement and Disparities, which is what kicked off that work. That is not pulling up the ladder. We can have a conversation about immigration. We can have a conversation about immigration.
She also denied systemic racism.
But
Kemi Badenoch. Not.
That is her choice. I said that I found those comments unhelpful. But if we're looking at the policies that this government and this cohort of Conservatives have brought in, I do not know how you can sit here and argue that they're pulling up the ladder.
I don't know how you can
for
argue
ethnic minorities. I'm uncomfortable.
Priti Patel pulling up the ladder. I've given a very black and white example.
But it's not. Look, people can have socially conservative views on migration if they like.
Is it not massively hypocritical?
Why is it hypocritical?
To do that?
Why
she is now Home Secretary and she has had that social mobility. She's benefited from it, as so many of them have.
So therefore,
and now she's denying it.
do the children of immigrants have to be? Do we have to believe in open borders?
It's not
necessarily what I think. But I'm just wondering.
But no, this is just this is just a discussion because. But see, but you just made my point. This is the generational thing that interests me. I don't have a judgment about it because I'm observing it. It's very interesting. This is not a question I would have asked at your age. See, this is an interesting thing. Now, I'm not condemning anybody. It's fascinating to watch this. There was something else you said about that Kemi said, which I can't remember now. We said so many things. And you said she didn't feel like she... See, the obligation, and maybe these were wrong obligations, maybe these were incorrect obligations, but the obligation on me when I was her age was to do XXX, and she doesn't feel that obligation. Now, that's fascinating. I'm going to say she's right. I'm not saying she's wrong. That is interesting. And what made the difference? What happened? And that's what we should be sort of looking at. And instead of saying right, left, I'm really, I had a talk with Bim. I met him. And I don't want to misquote him, but it was so interesting to talk to him because I'm sitting there as a black person, too, and thinking blah, 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 blah. And I want to understand this young conservative. I don't understand a black conservative, so I want to understand, why are you in the Conservative Party? What is the Conservative Party for you? And he explained it to me. And it was, I saw what he saw. I saw what he saw. What fascinates me is, how does he see that? How did he get to see that? And that is the question. I don't think that the end result is the question. It's how do you get there is the question. And something has shifted. Something has changed. And I think it does have to do with parenting. I think parents decided, a lot of parents of color decided, and you can't blame them. I'm sending my kid to this school, they're going this way, they're going that way, because I don't want them to go through this all-inclusive door that doesn't describe my kid at all. And parents made a conscious decision. So what is now coming on stream is a very interesting core of young conservatives of color who are going to be a big challenge to the left, because the left has no answers, okay? They don't have any answers to what these people are talking about. There's a lot of reaction. There's a lot of reaction. Yeah. I mean, I have answers, but they're personal answers, and I think we need to do that.
I could just carry on with this discussion for hours, but we are going to have to move on to our second topic of the evening. So, switching gears now. Thank you, though. It's been fascinating. Switching gears now and moving on to the second topic, relevant very much in the here and now. Let's talk about the climate crisis. This week across Europe, including in the UK, temperature records were shattered. I'm actually sweltering a bit now. Wildfires wreaked havoc, and tragically, hundreds of people have lost their lives due to the heat. In London alone, the fire brigade listed 10 major blazes, and the Mayor, Sadiq Khan, declared a major incident as entire streets in Dagenham and other areas were caught in fires caused by the heat. There is no getting away from the linking of this to climate change and then to net zero. The strategy that was published by the government in October, which included a commitment to end the sale of new fossil fuel cars by 2030 and gas boilers by 2035. But just this week, the High Court ordered the government to explain exactly how its policies will achieve the promised cuts to carbon emissions. But as they try to appeal to party members, are we seeing a rollback of the net zero policy from the Conservative leadership candidates? This has been really interesting to watch. What do we think? Paul, have you got any thoughts?
Well, they never had a net zero strategy. They had a net zero aspiration, and it doesn't match what you need to do to achieve net zero. For the record, I would say neither does Labour. Labour doesn't really have, it has a £28 billion a year spending plan, which hopefully at some point will get concretised. That's more than Conservatives. One of the reasons the Tories leave aside the climate scepticism, for me the big blockage for Conservatives, most Tories get the fact that we need to do net zero. The big blockage has been Rishi Sunak, and I think this is relevant to all the debate about leadership. Sunak believes philosophically that the people who should pay for climate change are this generation through tax, not the next generation through debt. And as a result, you can borrow to fix the furlough or to fix the COVID-19 issues, or even to give away money for people to pay their heating bills, but you cannot borrow to invest in climate. Meanwhile, there's an emergency. These fires that we saw in London and elsewhere were a classic example of what scientists call the feedback loop. That is, we don't understand. When there's an unstable system, the outcomes are not predictable. The grass that caught fire wasn't some part of sort of society, it was part of nature. It was just as the planet nature is telling us, it can't, sort of anthropomorphizing the planet there, it cannot take any more heating. So I would love it if one of the things we could do was to create a consensus, actually, during this Tory leadership campaign, that net zero is a real target, has to be made, is legally bound by the Climate Change Act of 2008. You cannot repeal it without a majority in the Lords and the Commons, and it will not get one. And then we've just got to go gangbusters for the measures. I hope that we could do it.
It doesn't look like, if Rishi gets in, it doesn't look like he's going to be on. And to be honest, both of them have indicated, on rowing back, that it's too much too fast. In fact, just today, I think a few hours ago, Rishi Sunak has basically promised the Tory party members that he will scrap bans, scrap lifting bans, on onshore winds, which I think is a massive blow.
Look, in one sense, they're right. It is too much, too far, too fast if you're trying to do it all through the market. If you're just trying to do it all through the sort of, would you please market, deliver some low carbon outcomes? We've got energy security crisis with the Ukraine, Russia. The lights might go off in Europe, in Central Europe this winter. You need far more than what we've had from either party. I think you need the state to if it only does one thing, I'd be glad if it does nothing else. In exchange for the state takes control of the energy system and manages it to a zero carbon state, whether it remains marketised, privatised or public ownership. I don't really care. I want it to be zero carbon for the next generation so they don't have to live with their houses on fire.
Your thoughts? But then we have not wanting to engage with one another in this issue, because then we have activists on both sides. They're all being driven by polls, they're being driven by focus groups, they're being driven by their own activists. And meanwhile, we're in a situation where, for me, we all wear petrol. That's where it should actually start, is we divest ourselves. But it's impossible almost to get people to come together because activists on both sides won't allow the parties to come together. I think it's logical.
What do you mean by that?
I think so. I think there is a drive, and it's not a bunch of people, but it is a drive to not work with so-and-so. Don't work with this person. Don't work with that person. I don't know if the Conservative Party in and of itself, is totally dedicated to this, because they wrap it all up in a thing called woke. I don't even know, that's just horrible. They do. And then suddenly it becomes a policy of non-action. I don't think MPs don't want to do anything, but they have to deal with their grassroots who see it as something else altogether.
So just a couple of points. The first major world leader to talk about climate change was Margaret Thatcher, probably the most famous Conservative Prime Minister of the 20th century. It was Theresa May that made net zero by 2050.
Churchill might be more.
Well, Churchill or Thatcher, let's say.
All right.
Theresa May, in, I think it was 2018, just as she was leaving office, signed into law the net zero target of 2050. I disagree that there is not a consensus on 2050, Paul. There is a consensus on 2050. It is a goal that the Conservative Party set, reset it at COP26, and it is something which has come up in the leadership debates, which all the candidates agreed to, by the way. Now, the question is, how do we get there? Paul thinks we should borrow more from your plans. It sounds like that is the right thing to do. In your opinion, you might get Conservatives like me saying, well, guess how much we're going to be paying on interest for our debt this year? About £83 billion. Interest rates are probably going to go up to tackle inflation, so the debt goes up and the payments go up, and how do we pay for it all? That is really where the debate is. There is consensus. I don't accept that there isn't consensus. The one concern, perhaps, that maybe we should have about the leadership election is where net zero and tackling climate change is for the Conservative Party membership on their
And that's what
agenda,
I'm talking about.
and it's quite low.
That's what I'm talking
but
about.
when we look at the wider electorate, net zero is a very popular policy, and that is why the Conservative Party, in their last manifesto in 2019, had that net zero commitment there, and that is why it is something which this government and all the leadership candidates are committed to.
But if it is low on the membership, for I don't know why it is, and why is it?
For example, if you look at onshore wind farms, they are seen by a lot of Tory party members as eyesores. No one wants them near their property. It's a very, sort of selfish viewpoint.
Well, I'm saying this to somebody looking at it from the outside. Everything you say, I absolutely agree with in that sense. And it goes back to what I said about focus groups, about I didn't say membership, I didn't use that word, but that's what I meant. The people who are the members of that party, of the Conservatives, are not interested in it as a priority thing. And so therefore, even though you're right in the things that you say, it didn't happen.
But let me just come back to this question of who's signed up to 2050. 2050 is too late. Yeah. It's manifestly too late. The science doesn't say that if Britain decarbonises by 2050, the world will stabilise. What it says is we need much faster decarbonisation, and that means some things that were priorities may not have to be priorities anymore. And I would say to my Labour colleagues, that includes some of the things that you're obsessed with as well. Over and above that, Britain's official path to decarbonisation is largely reliant on technologies that don't yet exist. Now, I'm not one of these people...
So how can you advocate for it to be brought forward if the technologies to get us there don't exist?
Because it is wrongly reliant on those technologies. I would say that it's a comfort blanket to think that carbon capture and storage and green hydrogen and the rest will do the job that the government's current plan. If you think about the pie chart of where the carbon's going to be removed, how it's going to be removed, too big a chunk of it comes from technologies that are not proven yet.
So how do we bring it forward is my question.
Radical social change in the use of energy.
Those were words. What are the practical policies
nationalise
that get us
the energy,
there by 2030?
nationalise the energy grid. Okay, so then, first of all, massive investment in public transport, massive investment in public, clean, green, cheap housing. So you create 20-minute neighbourhoods where people can walk to work. Major modal change, major change in the lifestyle. I think any politician who's not telling people that is not telling them the truth. And it is hard, because but my worry, by the way, with the Tories is not they call them windmills. We don't want any windmills on our lovely moor side. It's not that. It's the fact that there were people 2 weeks ago, mainly from West Wales and the southwest of England, who went onto the motorways and started to shut them down because they were protesting against fuel prices. And I think that could be the new UKIP. That could be the new Farageism if we're not careful. I think they've got a point, by the way. Petrol prices are high because of tax. And there doesn't need to be that level of tax on petrol. And one of the Labour's demands is to cut that on.
But then we've got a population, we've got a populace which has almost no faith in the central government at all, no belief in the central government. That is interesting to me because the Conservatives have been in charge of the government, more or less, for the last, I don't know, since 2010. And this relationship of the government being responsible to the people has been whittled down to a situation where the people feel that they can either individually say what they want and need, or they feel imposed upon, even to their own detriment. And it would seem to me that part of what conservative value, well, as I understand it, and it's sort of popularized, has to do with don't let the state do anything. Don't let the state be involved with you. And everything Paul just said sounds to the family of my friends that I have as socialist. So before anything else happens, I think the Conservative Party and the Republicans in the United States need to sit down and understand what these political sort of phrases that the grassroots gives them, in relation to the environment itself. I mean, that's part of what is happening.
But equally...
And one other quick thing, and I think with younger conservatives, which also fascinates me, is that these attitudes, these points of view, these positions are quote-unquote left, are quote-unquote socialist. They're not, they're human, but that's how, that's what people gather. And so some of them position themselves as opposed to it, so as not to be that. And not to say that they don't agree, but they position themselves opposed to this because we've hardened our conversation.
For sure, but equally what I would say is that we have to understand that the state isn't necessarily the answer to everything, and that more borrowing on top of a society which already borrows too much is not always the best way to get to net zero. And also there is a place for the private sector into getting to net zero to develop the technologies that we need in order to meet that target. That cannot just be met from the state, and it requires, I think, good faith on both sides. I have not seen very much good faith from either of you on this issue. You said there was no consensus. There is a consensus. Net zero has been driven by a Conservative government, and it will be achieved through subsequent governments working towards the same goal, which is net zero by 2050.
But it can't be done if the credo is the state can't do everything.
The state can't do everything.
Well,
the state can't do everything.
That's not how you start.
But can the state do everything?
It can give it a try. Give it a try.
Albie, how do you expect the private sector? You're saying the private sector needs to step in here.
Give it a try.
How do you expect the private sector to be incentivised if actually they're being incentivised by the government to literally do the opposite? So, for example, with the windfall tax, they're actually making money back on their investments by extracting more fossil fuels, for example. How do you expect that? Why is the private sector all of a sudden to go, do you know what, we're going to do the right thing here? We're going to forgo our profits. We're going to invest in renewables. We're going to stop, plundering fossil fuels. How is that going to happen?
Because there's money in it, Marina. There are hundreds of billions of pounds in the green economy which are being unlocked by the private sector as we speak in the northeast of England, providing thousands of jobs for red voters. You should speak to Ben Houchen. You should speak to Ben Houchen, the great mayor of the Tees Valley, about this, because he's very passionate about it. They're building wind turbines out there to put out at sea. They're making hydrogen cells, carbon capture technology, which are going to help get us to net zero by 2050. There is a place for the private sector in this. That is my argument.
Of course,
Your argument, it sounds like you said, let the state do everything. I said the state doesn't need to do everything.
I didn't say let it do
If the private sector
everything.
can step in and do it quicker, more efficiently,
I didn't say let the state do everything.
But you said let us try.
That's what I said.
But I don't think we need to do that.
Well, that's where we have our disagreement.
Yes.
I think we're going to need a state-directed plan. That's all. That's all I'm saying. Of course, the private sector will innovate. It can be the executor of the plan. But unless we've just not got used, or rather, we've got very unused to an actually state-directed economy. And if we were in a pre-climate change era, if climate change didn't exist, we'd be having a different argument about the relationship of the market and the state. I'm a big advocate of small-scale, non-market, cooperative, B Corp type socialism. But the one bit I think old-style planning actually matters in, and state ownership, is this, because nobody else can do it. Look what the French have done. French facing an energy crisis, and they are equally committed as we are to net zero. They just nationalised EDF. for 10 billion. They spent 10 billion of French taxpayers' money to nationalise EDF, the major, by the way, a major electricity supplier to people in this country, because they know it cannot function under both the market and, as it were, the plan. We're now dealing with planning, non-market actions by states to achieve goals, just as we did in the Second World War. The mobilisation of the private sector to a state-directed goal. I would have hoped there would be a constituency for that in conservatism, actually.
I am going to have to draw this to a close. I feel like we need to. I know, one, it's too hot, but two, we're out of time. It is a slightly shorter episode this evening because, frankly, we've all been melting in heat. But what did you think? I've got so many thoughts, so many questions. I think probably more questions than when I started. Any questions for our panellists in particular? Have any of them led you to change your mind? Let us know in the comments or on Twitter at Byline TV. And don't forget that if you go to byline.tv, you can have your say and get access to loads of extra perks like extended content, which is basically what we need here. Live Q&As and even chat directly with producers in our members-only live stream. So from all of us here in the studio, good night, and we'll see you again at the table next week.